Welcome to the Great Relearning. I'm Dr. Rob Williams. Special thanks to the Marion Institute and the three Baldwin brothers, Michael and Ian and Philip, for making this series possible. And with us in the studio today, here in Concord, Massachusetts, USA, we have the renowned Graham Hancock.
Good to be with you.
It is incredible to be with you. So, as a reminder to our listeners and viewers, our three framing questions for the Great Relearning about the human species. Number one, who are we? Number two, where have we been? And number three, where might we be going? And I can think of few humans more qualified to explore those three questions, Graham, than you.
Well, it's nice of you to say that, but I'm not sure if I can live up to the intro.
Well, so let's get right into it. You describe yourself as a journalist with a deep interest in prehistory.
Yes, I do. In the sense that it excludes things that I'm not. I'm not a historian, academically trained. I'm not an archaeologist, and I'm not a scientist. My background is in journalism and in investigative journalism and in boots on the ground reporting. However, when it comes to the subject of prehistory, which has been an intense focus of mine since the late 1980s, I have gradually formed an opinion about the material that I'm dealing with. So I would say that while my methods are journalistic, I'm also an advocate. And I'm an advocate for a neglected possibility, which is the possibility of a forgotten episode in the human story, as it is told to us and taught to us through the education system, through schools, through universities, and generally in the media. I'm advocating a different point of view. I don't see it as a simple, straightforward evolutionary process from relatively simple and uncomplicated to extremely sophisticated and complicated. I think there's been ups and downs in that story, and so I advocate the possibility of a lost civilization, specifically during the Ice Age. Now, it might be said that this differentiates me from journalists, because journalists are supposed to be extremely objective and not committed to one point of view or another. But when I watch journalists at work, I see that all journalists actually have a point of view and very frequently advocate a position. So I'm trying to use journalistic methods to advocate a possibility that I think has been neglected by mainstream history and archaeology, and to do so in their terms and their language. That I don't wish to present fanciful, unthought through, unsupported or unsubstantiated arguments. I want to document what I'm doing. I want to give my readers footnotes. Typically, a book of mine might have 2,000 footnotes in it, so that people know where I'm drawing my information from.
Yes, and your own publishing career is, I would say, storied. You've written how many books now, Brian?
I actually don't know.
Well, I don't either.
But I do know. I probably could work it out. But the first book that I ever wrote was the text for a photographic book, and it was a book called Journey Through Pakistan, and it was published in 1982. And this happened because I was working in Kenya at that time as the East Africa correspondent of The Economist, and I was working out of the office of the late great Muhammad Amin, who was just a brilliant photographer, wheeler dealer, hustler, war reporter. He just was a huge influence on my life. And Mo's background was in Pakistan, and he had connections in Pakistan, and he managed to get a deal to produce a very large format, beautiful book on Pakistan. He and Duncan Willits photographed it, and I wrote the whole text. So it meant I got to travel everywhere, and I had just a fantastic series of journeys in Pakistan. Of course, that was my introduction to ancient history, because then you have to grapple with the Indus Valley civilization. You have to grapple with Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, and that whole mystery. We still haven't deciphered the Indus Valley script, and I think that's where the seed of interest in prehistory was planted. But it was also when I realized that I'm much better writing at length, writing books, than I am writing 300-word stories for The Economist or other newspapers. I just felt much more comfortable.
So you've taken your journalistic street cred and you've applied it to longer works. That answers a question I have for you, actually. Coming back to something you said just a moment ago, you are challenging what seems to be called in the geological community this concept of gradualism.
Yes.
Can you just briefly explain what that is?
Yeah, I can. There's a horror of catastrophes as I discovered, and much to my surprise, in what I'm going to persistently call mainstream archaeology, because archaeology is actually divided into several streams, but there are dominant views that control how one's career may go in archaeology, and the dominant view at present is that we should expect that events will have unfolded in the past, much as they are unfolding today. In other words, if we don't see a global cataclysm today, then why should we be looking for one in the human past? And this just seems to me completely absurd, because the issue of cataclysms are not under the control of archaeologists and historians. They're under the control of the universe in which we live. The Earth is a beautiful home to live upon, but it also can be extremely dangerous and extremely violent. And then we're in interaction with the entire cosmic environment. We are a planet revolving around the sun, spinning on its own axis, part of a huge galaxy, part of the solar system, and then part of interstellar space. And out of interstellar space repeatedly appear objects in the form of comets, which can cause devastation on planet Earth. And right back when I first began to consider the possibility that there might be a lost civilization, which is not properly recognized in the record, I, together with other colleagues working in this field, came to the conclusion that we have to be looking at a cataclysm to explain the disappearance of a civilization. And secondly, that cataclysmic event occurred in round numbers around about 12,500 years ago. And this was before I had any sense of exactly what the cause of the cataclysm was. But there's material from ancient Egypt in particular, which uses astronomy. We have a wobble on the axis of the Earth, which is called the precession. Presently, the North Pole of the Earth points at Polaris. Polaris is our pole star. But because the axis is wobbling, it hasn't always pointed at Polaris, and it won't always point at Polaris. You can go back into different times when we had a totally different pole star, because it's doing this. And it's a cycle of about 26,000 years, 25,920 years. The Earth is the viewing platform from which we observe the stars. So changes in the orientation of the Earth in space will affect, first of all, the pole star, and secondly, most noticeably, will affect the constellations that rise behind the sun at key moments of the year. And in the ancient world, it seems that the spring equinox in the northern hemisphere, the March equinox, was regarded as the most important, and was considered to define the character of the age. Now, this is immediately a moment where historians and archaeologists will tend to roll their eyes and say that actually, the Babylonians and the Greeks were the first to identify the constellations of the zodiac. And how can we possibly attribute knowledge of those constellations to much earlier cultures? But I don't agree. I think the Babylonians and the Greeks inherited that knowledge. And our ancestors lived under light pollution-free skies. The sky was ever present. And you can still see that today if you get away from cities. There's this presence of the sky. And it's inconceivable that our ancestors would not have noticed that there are 12, actually 13 constellations that lie along the path of the sun during the course of the year. Of course, they knew it much, much earlier than before. So we live in the age of Pisces. presently. The fish, the constellation of Pisces, houses the sun on the spring equinox. It won't forever. The precessional wobble is shifting us out of Pisces and into Aquarius. We do indeed live in the dawning of the age of Aquarius. During the last period of ancient Egypt, it was the constellation of Aries that housed the sun. It's not an accident that ram-headed sphinxes line the processional entry to Karnak, and the ram was everywhere dominant in symbolism at that time. And before that, it was Taurus that housed the sun, and the ancient Egyptian culture venerated bulls in the age of Taurus. So to pretend that this is just an invention of late invention of the Greeks is completely absurd in my view. I won't go on endlessly about this, but the bottom line, working with astronomy, working with the layout of the three great pyramids on the ground, Robert Bauval's extremely insightful Orion correlation theory, which has been wrongly abused really by scholars, is a brilliant piece of insight. Orion is not just any constellation to the ancient Egyptians. Orion was the figure of the god Osiris in the sky. The constellation of Orion was the celestial image of the god Osiris. And therefore, it's most unlikely to be an accident that the three belt stars of Orion are replicated on the ground in the form of the three great pyramids. This was Robert's fundamental insight, but the second insight was that when we use precession and look at the exact patterning of those stars, we'll find that they're replicated at a date that's around 12,500 years before the present.
Yes.
And this is not to exclude the ancient Egyptians from the magnificent works of the Giza Plateau, because there are four narrow shafts that cut through the body of the Great Pyramid, and those pinpoint stars not 12,500 years ago, but 4,500 years ago. It's a very complicated monument.
Yes.
And the ancient Egyptians themselves said that they received a legacy of knowledge from the gods, as they put it.
What you call a transfer of technology.
I would say so, yes. And one of the mysteries is that we see evidence of that transfer taking place around 12,500 years ago in the form of the Great Sphinx in particular. Yeah. Which is an equinoctial monument. It is targeted perfectly due east. So it gazes at the rising sun at dawn on the spring equinox. And you can confirm that just by standing behind the Sphinx and looking where it's pointing. But actually, it's extremely accurate. Now, go there on the summer solstice and the sun rising far to the north of east. Go there on the winter solstice, far to the south of east. The spring equinox, the Sphinx is targeted perfectly on the rising sun. And then this raises the question, why have a lion-bodied monument targeting the rising sun on the equinox if it was built, as Egyptologists claim, in the age of Taurus? Surely it should be a bull. It seems to be out of place in that sense. And then we wind the skies back, and you find that 12,500 years ago, it was the constellation of Leo that housed the sun. So the Sphinx is gazing at its own celestial counterpart and speaking very directly to that time. And then secondly, we have the geology of the Sphinx, which is a huge tribute needs to be paid to the late, great John Anthony West, who really made the breakthrough in this field. And then he brought Professor Robert Schoch from Boston University, a geologist, to the Sphinx back in the early 1990s. And Schoch quickly realized that the Sphinx had been subjected to about 1,000 years of very heavy rainfall. And he now pins that date very much to the period known as the Younger Dryas, between around 10,800 BC and 9,600 BC, 12,800 years ago to 11,600 years ago. So we have astronomy and we have geology both coinciding on an extremely early date for the Great Sphinx. And then we have megalithic temples around the Great Sphinx, which are of enormous scale and which again are very complicated monuments. And the attribution of those temples to the fourth dynasty is extremely flimsy. There's really no solid basis for it whatsoever. It's an assumption. Undoubtedly, the fourth dynasty was involved in completing, tidying up, renovating those temples. But did it lay in place the original massive limestone blocks? I don't think so.
You're suggesting not, yeah. And it's fair to say, Graham, I think that the Egyptology is kind of the crown jewel of the archaeological field in some ways, isn't that right?
I would say it is.
Criticize, in other words, accepted wisdom around ancient Egypt is to invoke the wrath.
Yeah, well, it certainly has invoked the wrath in my case.
Well,
It's most unfortunate that it should be that way. I mean, science ideally should be, above all else, open-minded.
Agreed.
And should be, instead of feeling threatened and pulling up the drawbridge and mounting defense against any point of view that differs, it would be preferable if science were a little bit more open-minded on these matters.
Well, and it's nice to sort of put a pin in ancient Egypt, because I think if there's one ancient civilization that every school kid learns about, it's probably ancient Egypt.
Yeah, now, and there's a reason for that, because ancient Egypt has left us so much. In a culture where there was not a lot of stone present, for example, Mesopotamia, where they had to build largely in mud brick. Well, actually, surprisingly, a lot of that mud brick has survived, but it's not survived with the magnificence and the presence that the Egyptian stone monuments have survived. They left us a huge amount of material in stone. And then, of course, they left us their texts, which, thanks to the Rosetta Stone, we can translate into modern languages. Acres and acres of texts on temple walls all over Egypt, never mind the papyri of the Book of the Dead, which themselves are fascinating. The book of what is in the Duat, the pyramid texts are the origin of those so-called funerary texts of the ancient Egyptians. And you'll find those inscribed inside the walls of the pyramids of the 5th and the 6th dynasty, but you will not find them in the pyramids of the 4th dynasty.
Right. Yeah. And clearly, this world inside and out. So you are challenging then this concept of gradualism with a new proposal called catastrophism. Is that right?
I would say that's correct.
You're using the word cataclysm or cataclysms.
Yeah.
But the ism, it seems that from my reading of you, the challenge is gradualism is this idea of catastrophism, specifically this 1200-year period-ish,
yes,
called the Younger Dryas.
Well,
can you talk about that?
It's remarkably recent in human history, what happened was that the Ice Age reached its maximum extent around 21,000 years ago, and that's when you had truly gigantic ice caps on top of North America. Right down south of Canada into the northern United States, and equally gigantic ice sheets on top of northern Europe. So the first thing to realize is that at that time, both northern Europe and large parts of North America were uninhabitable, frozen wastelands. You had to go further south. You had to go down into the southern parts of North America and into Central America and into South America to get a congenial climate at that time. The Ice Age began very gradually to warm up as the thousands of years went by. And from about 14,000 years ago down to 12,800 years ago, there was this very gentle warming trend, which resulted in a slow trickle of sea level rise as the ice sheets melted and the world got warmer. But then, suddenly, almost overnight in geological terms, actually almost overnight in human terms, the climate radically shifted, and it went from being warm and congenial, almost as warm as it is today, to suddenly frozen again, and as cold as it was at the peak of the last ice age. And this episode of freezing was accompanied by an anomalous episode of sea level rise 12,800 years ago, quite fully confirmed by Bahamian corals, which can only exist at a certain number of meters below the surface of the sea, I think 4 or 5 meters. So when the sea rises, they drown, they die. And this gives you a good calibration of the dates. There was definitely sea level rise at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, and that's a puzzling thing, because when the world goes cold, you wouldn't expect to see the world oceans getting bigger. You'd expect to see more water taken out of them and frozen into ice caps. That's the first anomaly. Then you have 1,200 years of utterly freezing cold. And during that time, there's strong evidence of a radical bottleneck in human populations. There's indisputable evidence that the great megafauna of the Ice Age, the woolly rhinos, the mammoths, the mastodons, the giant sloths, and my God, those giant sloths they were huge, enormous, and indeed the horse in North America.
Yes.
all of these went extinct in that episode. That period is roughly 12,800 to 11,600 years ago, 10,800 BC to 9,600 BC.
So it's a long time in obviously human terms, 1,200 years, but in geological time,
it's very short.
Yeah,
it's very short,
yeah.
and it was very bad.
Cataclysmic.
It was cataclysmic.
Yeah.
It was cataclysmic at the beginning, and it was cataclysmic at the end.
Yeah.
Because the end of the Younger Dryas witnessed a sudden warming of the Earth's climate, and again a sudden rise in sea level, which is nominated as Meltwater Pulse 1b, and that occurred 11,600 years ago. And then we entered the Holocene. We entered the age in which we all now live.
Yes, I was going to ask you. So the Holocene emerges on the heels of this catastrophic
event.
And why is it called the Younger Dryas?
It's called the Younger Dryas because there's also an older Dryas. There was an earlier cold snap, not nearly as severe.
Okay.
And a particular kind of alpine flower, Dryas something or other, I don't remember the details, flourishes in cold climes. And so it flourished all over the world. And that's why it's referred to as that. But it is.
I missed that in one of your footnotes, but I've been meaning to.
That's the reason. And what's fascinating about it is that it is truly recent in the human story. It's just like yesterday that this happened, and out of that yesterday, and the period of darkness in human memory that precedes it, out of that yesterday emerges the first accepted signs of civilization. That we switch from the Upper Paleolithic into the Neolithic. Our ancestors start behaving in different ways. They become more socially organized. They become more hierarchical. They start practicing war, which they did not do in the Upper Paleolithic. There was almost no war in the Paleolithic at all. Hunter-gatherers largely, and there's a big shift, and agriculture is introduced. Around about 11,600 years ago, mainly in Turkey is one of the first places where you see it.
I want to go there in a minute. But the official narrative, and I've taught it myself for a long time as a historian, is channeling our inner, let's say, Yuval Noah Harari for a moment in his book *Sapiens*. 99% of human history, we were hunting and gathering, and then 10 to 12,000 years ago, depending on whose data you use, agriculture began to emerge. And then things got more complex from there. And what you're suggesting actually is a much different take on this. And I'm wondering, can you take us to Gobekli Tepe in Turkey? Because it seems like this, of all the places around the world, seems to be the one that reveals perhaps the most about your proposal here.
Well, Gobekli Tepe is a kind of smoking gun when it comes to the possibility of a lost civilization. You see, it was until the discovery of Gobekli Tepe, it was the firmly held view of archaeology that it took a Neolithic culture to create megalithic monuments. You know, if you're going to create a gigantic stone circle like Stonehenge or Avebury in Britain, the argument is that you need a highly organized, structured workforce. You need an economy that is producing surpluses, so that not everybody has to be in the business of hunting and gathering food, that you can allow people to specialize, that they can become engineers, architects, astronomers. And it was argued that could only occur in a culture that had already been practicing agriculture for a very long time. Hunter-gatherers don't generate surpluses. And this was the firmly held view that we would not find any megalithic monument older than about 6,000 years old. And the oldest often accepted was Gigantea in Malta, which is about 6,000 years old. That you wouldn't find any before that. And this is why when the issue of the Great Sphinx came up, the standard reaction to that from archaeologists was it's impossible for the Great Sphinx to be 12,000 plus years old. It just simply can't be, because there's no other monument anywhere in the world.
And humans were hunting and gathering anyway.
And humans were hunting and gathering, so they wouldn't have had the organizational skills, they wouldn't have had the surfaces to create a 270-foot long, 100-foot high, massive monument cut out of solid bedrock. But then suddenly Gobekli Tepe begins to enter the consciousness of this academic community. Well, actually, Gobekli Tepe was first reconnoitered in the 1950s. Wow. But it was overlooked. the team who were reconnoitering were looking specifically for remains from the Upper Paleolithic, for Stone Age remains. And they found a few bits of stone jutting out of the side of the hill pillars, and they were so perfect and so beautifully done that they went no further. They decided this is a Byzantine ruin. The perfection of such perfection never took place in the Stone Age, according to the mindset at that time. And Gobekli Tepe was passed by, and it wasn't until 1996 when Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute took a deeper interest in it and began to do some scratching excavations that he realized that there was a gigantic megalithic site underneath this hill.
It's astonishing.
It truly is astonishing, and it's the perfect megalithic site to date, because it's quite difficult to use carbon dating on megalithic sites around the world. If those sites, like the Maltese sites, have been tramped over by dozens of cultures over thousands of years, constantly out in the open, you can't really be sure that the bit of organic material that you're dating with carbon dating doesn't date stone. It only dates organic material. You can't really be sure, excuse me, that bit of carbon datable material defines the age of the site. It might have been introduced much later. Certainly, you're going to have to find it in extremely explicit circumstances. For example, underneath a 50-ton megalith, that might be persuasive. But there's very little. There's very little of that. So the dating of megalithic sites is typically very difficult. But Gobekli Tepe is an exception, because those who created Gobekli Tepe, we now know that the work began 11,600 years ago, bang on the end of the Younger Dryas, and bang on the end of that second cataclysm that marked the end of the Younger Dryas. And we know that why? Because Gobekli Tepe was run as a site. It functioned for about 1,000 years, from roughly 11,600 years ago down to 9,600 years ago. 10,600 years ago, 9,000, from 11,600 years ago down to 10,600 years ago, about 1,000 years, give or take a century. And then it was decommissioned. It was closed down completely. We have to envisage teams of workers with rubble, pouring the rubble in. We have 4 major stone circles, dozens of smaller stone circles, and actually only part of the site's been excavated. We know from ground penetrating radar that there's a lot more underground.
Yes, you speak of the LiDAR technology.
Well, LiDAR technology is less useful in Gobekli Tepe. Their ground penetrating radar and seismic tomography are most useful. LiDAR is useful when you have a rainforest and you want to see.
I see. Can I pause you there? Because for people who don't know and haven't seen your Netflix series Ancient Apocalypse, which visually is so helpful, can you just paint us a quick picture of Gobekli Tepe? Like, what have you discovered there? I mean, you described these big structures, and you described some of them.
Well, the first and most important thing is the dating issue. Because Gobekli Tepe was sealed, it was decommissioned, it was closed down, it was buried. And probably more work went into burying it than went into creating it. That's why it's always felt like a time capsule to me. It meant that there was no contamination by later cultures, no introduced carbon datable organic materials. Gobekli Tepe was hermetically sealed until it was opened in 1996. And that's where we get in enclosure D, the oldest dating, which is 11,600 years ago, absolutely unquestionably correct. That circle of roughly 20-ton pillars, two pillars in the range of 10 to 20 tons, are at the center of it, and then it's surrounded by a series of other pillars. These pillars in the center are T-shaped. They mimic a human body. The T at the top, the cross of the T, is a head. And then they have arms carved into their side and hands that meet across the belly. So they're anthropomorphic pillars, but on an enormous scale. And with rather precise alignments. There are 4 main enclosures, and the enclosures date from slightly different periods over the 1,000-year period that Gobekli Tepe ran. But one of the things they appear to have been doing is targeting the rising of the star Sirius, and there's a shift in orientation as you go down. So this speaks to astronomy. The world's oldest perfectly north-south building is found in Gobekli Tepe, so far as we've found.
Yeah,
there may be more to find. So it's a series of not exactly stone circles, but stone enclosures, more oval than circular in form, which contain massive megalithic pillars, and where the pillars are often intricately carved in high relief with beautiful animal figures, as well as the arms and the hands. You find foxes, you find birds, you find vultures, you find the images of human beings as well.
Yeah, extraordinarily beautiful and very provocative.
Very, very provocative. And the heart of it is Pillar 43 in Enclosure D, which is a very complicated pillar. It depicts a vulture with an outstretched wing, and there's a circle over the outstretched wing. There's a scorpion directly beneath it. And there are other figures above it, and what it looks like is a representation of the sky when the sun is in Sagittarius on the solstice. Again, I go into this in enormous depth in my books with footnotes, but the view that I've come to, which is shared by many who focus on Gobekli Tepe, is that whatever else these people were, they were astronomers, and they were using astronomy to communicate information. And part of the information that is communicated in that astronomy, if you take Pillar 43 as a constellation diagram, it is very specifically drawing attention to a date that's 12,800 years before our time, and 1,200 years before Gobekli Tepe it's targeting the beginning of the Younger Dryas.
The cataclysm.
It's targeting the cataclysm. And if you want to communicate a message to the future, you would not be wise to communicate it in a written script. Especially if you're thinking of thousands of years. The written script is most unlikely to be deciphered, as is the case with the Indus Valley script still to this day. If it's written on anything less permanent than stone, it just won't survive at all. But even if it's written on stone, how do we decipher it? So what you want to use is a universal language, which anybody who approaches the material realm with a rational mind will be able to work out. And astronomy is one of those languages. It's very effective for pinning down dates and times. And I've often pointed out that we still do this in our culture today. The Hoover Dam in the United States has a giant star map built into it. There's some controversy around this now. Some people want to clear it away, but it's not as enduring as Gobekli Tepe, but it has this huge star map. And what that star map does is it freezes the skies over the dam at the moment of the dam's completion. So 10,000 years from now, if anybody cared, they would be able to say when the Hoover Dam was built. And
that's amazing.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
And I and my colleagues think that this is the same. That's with Gobekli Tepe and with Giza too.
Okay, so Gobekli Tepe then really, you've described it as a smoking gun because it reveals this technology transfer.
Far ahead of its time.
Far ahead of
its time. This is 6,000 years before, actually 7,000 years before Stonehenge.
Yes.
You know, there's a huge gap before the next megalithic structures appear. I think that will be gradually filled in. But what Gobekli Tepe did is it overturned a paradigm.
Yes.
Those who are committed to the paradigm don't accept that it's been overturned.
The gradualists.
Yeah, so they're desperately rushing to make Gobekli Tepe a gradual thing. But that's really difficult to do because it does just pop suddenly out of nowhere.
And you describe Gobekli Tepe as a reboot.
Yeah, I think.
What do you mean by that?
Well, again, I need to emphasize that I'm proposing a hypothesis here, not facts. This is a hypothesis that I and a number of colleagues have worked on. That there was a gigantic global cataclysm 12,800 years ago, the onset of the Younger Dryas, and that it had a devastating impact on a civilization that was more technologically advanced than typical hunter-gatherer civilizations. And it's important to be clear about this. I'm not sneering at or despising hunter-gatherer civilizations who are remarkable in their own right. But you can't wake up one morning as a hunter-gatherer and know how to create a perfectly astronomically aligned site with 20-ton megaliths. It's just
with anthropomorphic features.
with anthropomorphic features. It's just not something that you're going to be able to accomplish in a single night.
Right.
You have to have generations who've built up experience in doing this kind of thing, and we don't see the evidence for those generations on the site. Therefore, I'm inclined to suppose that experience was built up elsewhere by the survivors of a lost civilization. And they brought this idea to Gobekli Tepe, but not only to Gobekli Tepe, to other places around the world. I think Gobekli Tepe was used to mobilize the local population. It was a project that could bring them all together. And so it's not an accident that just at the same time as we see this sudden appearance of sophisticated megalithic architecture, we also see the gradual introduction of agriculture. And within that 1,000 years that Gobekli Tepe runs, the local population goes from being entirely hunter-gatherers to being entirely agriculturalists. And that, I think, was the purpose of Gobekli Tepe.
Yeah, so smoking gun, reboot of civilization. And then I was so curious about the time capsule element. Why would they devote so much of their resources to covering it up? But you're suggesting, I think, if I'm reading you correctly, they're protecting it for future.
Definitely.
Future generations.
That's my view, protecting it for future generations, as is the case with a lot of megalithic architecture. It's so massive, it's very, very, very hard to destroy. What goes around comes around. We are involved in a cyclical process here. The precession itself is a cyclical process. But the argument behind what is called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which is truly a catastrophist hypothesis, and it's not my hypothesis at all. It's a hypothesis of a group of scientists, people like Jim Kennett and Chris Moore and Alan West. They're all PhD leading figures in their fields of geoscience, geoarchaeology, are behind the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Richard Firestone was one of the first to propose it. The suggestion is Bill Napier is an astronomer working with this same group of scientists. They call themselves the Comet Research Group.
Yes.
There's about 60 of them, maybe more. They've published literally hundreds of papers since 2007, firmly supporting the initial supposition that something cataclysmic happened 12,800 years ago. The fundamental evidence is what's called the Younger Dryas boundary layer. And this is a layer of earth in the soil that is found prominently in North America. In Ancient Apocalypse, we showed an example from Murray Springs in Arizona, where you have a layer of the soil about the width of a human hand, and it's very dark. It's often referred to as the black mat, and it's full of the chemical signatures of a really nasty cosmic impact. Melt glass, even more worrying, melted quartz. You need temperatures in excess of 2,200 degrees Celsius to melt quartz. Platinum. Carbon microspherules and evidence of wildfires that burned in that.
Remembering iridium as well.
Iridium is very much present in the Younger Dryas boundary layer. So it's prominent in North America. It's also found in South America, as far south as Chile. It's also been found in Antarctica. It crosses the Atlantic. It's found in Belgium. And it's found as far east as Abu Huraira in Syria, which is actually very close to Gobekli Tepe. And it's important to be clear that primarily what we're dealing with is not massive impacts that create huge craters, but fragments that might be 100 meters, 150 meters in diameter, which don't have enough solidity to reach the earth and create a crater. They blow up in the air. They're called air bursts. And we have a recent, very relevant example of that. When I say recent, it's the 30th of June, 1908. It's a 20th century event, and it's called the Tunguska event. And this was in Siberia, an object that astronomers now believe was about 100 meters in diameter, came in on the 30th of June, 1908, and exploded in the sky above what was fortunately an uninhabited Siberian forest. It completely flattened 2,000 square kilometers of trees. It caused devastation on a scale that, were it to have happened in a major city, you would have been looking at life loss in the millions. It was just fortunate for humanity that it occurred over an uninhabited area. The other interesting thing is the date, the 30th of June, 1908, because that's at the peak of one of the two crossings of what's called the Torrid meteor stream. The Earth crosses the Torrid meteor stream twice a year, and the Torrid meteor stream, like all meteor streams, is the disintegrated remnant of a former comet. And the Torrid meteor stream includes cometary objects. Its best known member is Comet Encke, which is about 6 kilometers in diameter. And Comet Encke has all the features of a comet, but it's a fragment of a much larger comet. Bill Napier's work suggests that we are looking at a comet that was perhaps as much as 100 miles in diameter, which entered the inner solar system about 20,000 years ago, and then became trapped by the gravity of the sun and went into an orbit that crossed the orbit of the Earth. And that's not too much of a, even with a 100-kilometer object, space is a pretty big place. And one object whizzing around at tens of thousands of miles an hour, crossing the orbit of the Earth, isn't too much of a worry, because the chances of us hitting it are quite low. But then the gravitational forces begin to break it up into multiple fragments, some of which may be large, like Comet Encke, some of which may be dust size and just produce shooting stars. It widens out from being 100 miles or so wide to being 30 million kilometers wide. That's the Torrid meteor stream. It takes the Earth 12.5 days to pass through the Torrid meteor stream. And we do so in June, 30th of June, 1908 was at the peak of the Beta Taurids. And we do so at the end of October, beginning of November. Get great shooting stars at that time, the Halloween fireworks, they call them.
Yes.
But hidden in that meteor stream are many huge objects, hundreds of asteroids, which may have a diameter of 1 kilometer or more. And it poses a real and present danger to the Earth today. And were we to be focusing, NASA is beginning to focus on asteroid impacts and what they might do to the Earth, and there's been some sampling of the asteroid Bennu and so on and so forth. In my mind, the top priority target should be the Torrid meteor stream. We should be paying close attention to it. And it's not gloom and doom, because it is something we can do something about. We've got the tech to do something about it.
Yeah, that's right. And you propose that the Younger Dryas cataclysm was perhaps that Torrid meteor.
Yes.
Yeah.
The Younger,
to be clear about that.
Yeah, the onset of the Younger Dryas saw. This is theory. This is hypothesis. Yeah. This is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Saw several objects fall out of the Torrid meteor stream as it crossed the orbit of the Earth. And in many cases, those objects burst in the air, like the one over Abu Huraira. It never hit the ground. And in other cases, there might have been objects of 1 kilometer or so in diameter, which certainly did hit the ground. But what ground they hit was the North American ice cap primarily. So that ice cap's still 1 mile deep. You do get some shock effects on the ground beneath the ice cap, but primarily the crater was excavated in the ice cap. Yeah. Two things happen. Firstly, that crater is no longer discoverable 10 or 12,000 years later, because the ice is all gone. It's an ice crater. And secondly, the shock and the heat of the impact releases a huge amount of icy meltwater, and down it pours across the Channel Scablands and into the world ocean, both the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. And the Atlantic outflow stopped the Gulf Stream in its tracks. And this is where the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis coincides, but provides the first ever explanation for what is given as the reason for that sudden cooling. Nobody disputes that the Younger Dryas began with this sudden deep freeze, and it's generally accepted that what brought it about was a huge flood of meltwater into the world ocean, which cut the Gulf Stream. And it's called the global meridional overturning circulation. Think of it as the central heating system of our planet, warm currents that flow around the Earth, all interconnected. You interrupt that, and you are going to get very, very cold very, very quickly. And that's what happened. But when that theory, which is universally accepted, was proposed, nobody asked themselves the next question is why? Why was there a sudden release of meltwater on this enormous scale capable of doing this? And the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis provides the answer. It says because of these impacts, primarily on ice caps, which resulted in the release of the water. And what's the evidence? Well, we can't show you a crater, but we can show you the Younger Dryas boundary layer all over the Earth. And cumulatively, it can only have been caused by one thing.
Yeah. So, Graham, why is there so much resistance to this proposal? Having read your books and having enjoyed and the ancient apocalypse and really visually it's stunning. It's so helpful just to travel to these places.
I think that I think that it's part of the way that science functions. Once a paradigm has been set, and in this case, for example, there's a large group of archaeologists who have their own explanation for why the Ice Age megafauna went extinct, and that explanation is humans did it.
Yes,
it's called the overkill hypothesis.
Yes, the overkill. I'm familiar.
And many careers are invested
Yes.
in that notion, and it's quite a politically correct notion because it reminds us that we are a predator species who can do great harm. There's nothing wrong with that. You know, it's important to realize that. But I am not aware of any hunter-gatherer group anywhere surviving on the earth today which hunts its prey to extinction. They live in harmony with their prey, and I believe it was true of hunter-gatherers during the Ice Age as well. I don't think that hunter-gatherers were responsible for the extinction of the megafauna at all. Otherwise, why not make them extinct 10,000 years earlier?
Well, that's it. And I remember when I started researching your proposal, I had always been skeptical of the overkill hypothesis from what I had come to understand about hunting-gathering societies. It just didn't make any sense.
It makes no sense.
Yeah. So,
but
yes,
what we have to understand is that it's a paradigm. And that there are large numbers of careers invested in it. And if it's wrong, nobody wants to be wrong. At a certain point, an alternative theory becomes an existential threat to your own career. And I think there's been a sort of natural tendency to resist new ideas, particularly if they're catastrophic or cataclysmic in nature. When uniformitarianism, the notion that things proceed at a steady, gradual pace, as they always have done and they always will, is still the ruling paradigm. It's beginning to be changed. More and more scientists are willing to accept that cataclysms have played a role, and I think the Younger Dryas, as it's better understood, is going to shift that paradigm. But right at the moment, we're in the middle of a scientific battle with a group of scientists who are proposing a profoundly catastrophist theory and other scientists who completely dispute that theory, and it gets bogged down. Now, you know, you could say it's a good thing, and probably is a good thing, that new ideas in science should be subjected to intense and harsh criticism. And that's a kind of survival of the fittest argument, that only the new ideas that are particularly fit will survive that harsh criticism. And if they do, then they're probably right. But I've always wondered whether that's healthy for science. And wouldn't it be better for science to say, okay, well, here's an extraordinary hypothesis. Let's see what's in it that's good. Let's see what's in it that's useful, rather than this mindset of let's destroy it. Let's pile down on it like a huge gang and just beat it up. and by the way, you know, inflict ad hominem attacks on the scientists who have proposed it. Use every dirty propagandistic trick under the book in the book to undermine this hypothesis.
Well, that's been the most curious thing as a professor of propaganda and communications myself. In addition to environmental history, I'm just so struck by how strange that is. And you know, if we channel our inner as Thomas Kuhn, right, the structure of scientific revolution.
The structure of scientific revolution. He got it right.
You got it right. So you have engaged the support, I would say, of some of the world's most popular podcast voices, and you've had an incredibly successful eight-part.
The
Netflix series, Ancient Apocalypse, which has done better than most any. So, to me, Graham, looking in at this debate, it kind of feels like you're winning.
I think there's two debates here. No new hypothesis is going to be the accepted conventional wisdom, while large numbers of scientists oppose it, and that's just a plain fact. And Kuhn recognized that.
Yes, he did.
You know, that a paradigm shift takes a long time
Yes.
to bring about, and often, sadly, you have to see the supporters of the old paradigm die off really before a new one is accepted.
Old ideas must die for new ones to
The example I give most frequently in my books is the Clovis first hypothesis in the Americas. This notion of a very recent peopling of the Americas became locked in as a paradigm that there were no human beings in America before about 13,400 years ago. They named them the Clovis culture. We don't know what they called themselves. They made particular flint tools with fluted points, quite sophisticated. They're supposed to have been the first Americans, and this was just a universally accepted view. It was taught in every school, every university, right through from kindergarten, actually, that these were the first Americans. And every time new information came up, they said, actually, hang on, that here's evidence from Bluefish Caves in the Yukon that people were here 24,000 years ago. That's 11,000 years before Clovis. Well, what happened was, instead of embracing these new finds, the archaeological community universally rejected them and poured scorn upon the individuals who proposed those new finds. And the sad case of Jacques Cinq-Mars, who investigated Bluefish Caves in the Yukon, found evidence for a human presence 24,000 years ago. His career was utterly ruined. He died a broken man. He was shunned by his colleagues. They passed him without speaking in the corridors. His research funding was withdrawn. But he was right. And that was only confirmed in 2017. Wow. When a re-excavation of Bluefish Caves proved that poor Jacques Cinq-Mars, who'd been so humiliated, so insulted, so beaten up by his colleagues for daring to propose something that they didn't agree with, was actually right all along. And we're now seeing this gradual climb down as more and more evidence comes in. 20,000-year-old footprints from New Mexico is a recent example, but a less well-known example is evidence of human beings butchering a mastodon 130,000 years ago, just south of San Diego, the Cerruti mastodon site, which the excavations from there are on show in the San Diego Natural History Museum. That was initially published in Nature. You don't get an article published in Nature, particularly when it's proposing human beings in the Americas 10 times older than they were supposed to be, unless you've done very solid work.
The apex journals are cautious.
Yeah. But they got their story in Nature, and since then, of course, Tom Desmarais and his colleagues have been under massive attack from the rest of archaeology for daring to propose that humans might have been present 130,000 years ago. But we have other examples. A site called Huatlico may go back 250,000 years. I think we need to re-examine all of these sites that have just been in a cavalier way dismissed by the establishment. We have to consider the possibility that human beings, whether anatomically modern or whether in the form of Neanderthals or Denisovans, that members of the human species have been present in the Americas for tens of thousands of years. And this changes everything because it suddenly opens up a huge window that nobody's ever explored of what was going on in that time.
Yeah, there's the sense, I think, among many humans that in the professional classes that our knowledge is fixed and our stories are officially determined. But you said something to me before we began about the public's thirst, I think, for expanding the conversation and being more open-ended.
I think so. I think we see it at an individual level, the popularity of sites like 23andMe, where people want to go into their genetic heritage. And we see it at a broader cultural level. We want to know where we came from, who we are. Is there anything from the past that can shed light on? It's a great mystery to be alive.
It is.
I mean, really, think about it for a moment. It's an extraordinary mystery. So anything that can shed light on that can help us to understand things better. And often the ancient cultures like the ancient Egyptians paid much more attention to these mysteries than we do today. The present religion is the religion of scientism, the materialist reductionism, where everything must be weighed, measured, and counted. If it doesn't have a material substrate, then it doesn't exist. It can't be counted upon. That was not how the ancient Egyptians looked at things. They went much more deeply into the mystery of existence. So I think there's a fascination with the past, and a sense of something missing.
Yes.
That many people are affected by. And then this is coupled by a new phenomenon, which was not present in the 1940s and 1950s, which is an increasing skepticism with authority. We are still dominated by authority. People do, by and large, still do what they're told. There is still a mainstream narrative that's fed to us continuously through the mass media. Nevertheless, there has emerged in the last couple of decades doubt about the wisdom of authority figures. We don't any longer think that governments are always right. We don't put our faith in the big corporations in the way that we used to. And increasingly, we don't put our faith in the big religions either. Yeah. They're all seen as disruptive influences. So there's I would regard a healthy climate of skepticism towards authority. And this affects the way we look at prehistory as well.
Yeah, it's beautifully said. And I think there's a small group of humans, Graham, who are, putting on my professor hat for a minute, uncancelable.
Yeah.
Joe Rogan.
Yeah,
is uncancelable.
It'd be pretty hard to cancel Joe.
Jordan B. Peterson is uncancelable. Yeah. I would put you, and I hope you take this in the spirit. I'm shy. To me, in the world of prehistory, you seem to me, Graham Hancock, you seem to be uncancelable. And
well, I'm not sure about that. There was a concerted effort after the release of Ancient Apocalypse.
I
have me cancelled.
Yes, I watched that.
The Society for American Archaeology open letter to Netflix, basically demanding that the series be reclassified as science fiction because it didn't agree with their point of view of the past, was an attempt to cancel me. That's how you, if you can exert enough force and pressure, and you can sound serious and grim enough, you might terrify a network into doing something. Well, actually, fortunately, Netflix has a mind of its own.
Yes.
But nevertheless, this was the effort. It was why in that open letter, certain labels were applied to me. I was accused of racism, white supremacism, anti-Semitism, misogyny. Now, this is really weird because none of these issues appear in the series. Not a single one of them. Race is not mentioned in the series at all. But what they are is labels that are used to cancel people.
Exactly.
And I do feel, without wishing to sound overly paranoid, that a concerted effort was made to get me cancelled. Just to get rid of Concord, get me off the air.
Yeah.
And that effort did not succeed, but I don't expect it to stop. I've been grappling with hostile academia since I published Fingerprints of the Gods in 1995. It wasn't new to me. To some extent, that I expected the reaction to Ancient Apocalypse. It was far more ferocious than I had expected, but I knew it was coming.
Yes,
and that's why I said in the series that the archaeologists regard me as public enemy number one, and actually they went ahead and proved that with the reaction that they had to me.
And the flip side of that, on a positive, is that it generates curiosity.
Yes,
ordinary people who are just open. To questions and conversation.
Well, let me ask So for example, the headline was repeated in several newspapers: is that Ancient Apocalypse is the most dangerous show. Well, actually, for a lot of viewers, that's a turn on, not a turn off.
Like, let's watch that. Yeah. What's he up to? Yeah. I love that. Well, so last question. This week in the United States is what we used to call Columbus Day. And now it's, of course, called Indigenous Peoples Day. And I've taken to calling it Indigenous Columbus Day, just because I'm a both and sort of guy. But I'm curious, as we wrap up here, what advice, wisdom would you impart to Homo sapiens, Team Human, the human species in this moment?
Get rid of our leaders. The terrible, dismal performance of leadership all around the world. They're completely failing the human race. Whether it's America, whether it's Russia, whether it's the Arab countries, whether it's Israel, all over the world, there's this intensely nationalistic, angry, hateful leadership, which leaders benefit from stirring up the population and multiplying hatred and fear and suspicion. And I don't think the human race benefits from that. I mean, if I look at the three factors that have been most malicious and most damaging in the human story over the past few thousand years, certainly the past 2,000 years, I would say the mainstream monotheistic faiths have played a hugely negative role. They, of course, play up their positive role. They all talk the talk about peace and love, but they don't walk that walk. Just go back to the Crusades. The mainstream religions have been a negative force in the world, and that's my view. I agree that I know that many people will disagree with me. Big governments have been a negative force in the world. Governments have an investment in multiplying hatred and fear and suspicion, because then it makes the population feel they need that government. And of course, the big corporations as well are equally implicit in this, complicit in this, in creating a worldview where their narrative prevails and no other narrative is allowed. So I would say quite seriously that we need to ask ourselves, is the present form of leadership that dominates planet Earth serving humanity well? And on the record, I would say that the present form of leadership in virtually any country is not serving humanity well. If its leadership behavior leads to more conflict, more anger, more hatred, more fear, more suspicion, and more needless deaths, then that system is not serving humanity well. And we're in a process of consciousness awakening. It's been happening slowly, probably for hundreds of years. I think consciousness, the level of human consciousness, was actually much higher in ancient Egyptian times than it is today. So it rose up and then it fell. And now we're kind of crawling out of the mire again.
I feel that too. And something you said a few moments ago, life is mysterious.
It's a very mysterious thing.
Bring back the mystery.
And a great privilege to be born in a human body. The Buddhists knew this, and the ancient Egyptians did too. There's that scene, the judgment scene in the ancient Egyptian books of the dead, where the deceased is ushered into what's called the Hall of Maat. The goddess Maat represents cosmic truth and justice. She wears a feather on her headdress. In the center at the far right of the scene, you see the god Osiris sitting on a throne. Before him, a creature called Ammit, who's the eater of the dead. And in the middle, you have a scale. And the god Thoth, who's supposedly the inventor of writing, is standing by to write the verdict. Wow. And the scale, in the scale is measured a symbol of the soul of the deceased, his heart or her heart, and it's weighed against the feather of truth. And you do not want your heart to be heavy with sin and malice and wickedness at that point. But there's more to it than that. Moral behavior is undoubtedly investigated in the judgment scene. There are 42 negative assessors who ask you questions that you should be able to say no to. They're all moral sins. But there's more. The heart of the matter is, it's called the weighing of words. And the heart of the matter is, you were given this incredible gift to be born in a human body. You were given an unbelievably rare opportunity. What did you do with it? Did you use it well? Or did you squander it and waste it? And if you squandered it and wasted, you're heading to Ammit. You're not going to come back for another encounter with the physical realm. Your story is over. It's very brutal in that respect. And unfortunately, I think our societies today, all over the world, are structured to force human beings to waste the opportunity of life, not to grapple with it full on, not even to be able to grapple with it because their economic circumstances may be so disastrously awful, and to persuade us that we are just, particularly in the West, that we are just material creatures, that there's nothing else to us but matter, that we're a complete accident of chemistry and biology, that there is no such thing as life after death. This is a fundamental proposition of mainstream science, but mainstream science can't know that. That is not subject to experiment. That is not subject to replication. We don't know what happens to us after we die. It's one of the great mysteries. And I prefer to think of death as the beginning of the next great adventure rather than as the end of this one.
Beautifully said. Let's end it there. Okay. Can we do this again?
Yeah, absolutely.
One last question. What's next for you, Graham?
I'm hoping eventually to get back to more books. I'm doing a lot of work in television at the moment because that's a very good way to reach audiences who haven't known my work. But I think I've got one more big non-fiction book in me. I'm 73 now, And
Wear it well, my friend.
thank you. But I'm becoming aware of the years, and the body won't do what I ask of it in the way that it did 20 or 30 years ago. I think I have one more big non-fiction book in me, and that is a book that I will work on with my wife, Santa, who is a photographer, brilliant photographer. We've worked together for 30 years. It'll be a photographic book. And I have an interest in novels.
Yes, you do.
I've written 3 novels about the Spanish conquest of Mexico. If it weren't for this huge explosion of information on the Younger Dryas and Gobekli Tepe, which drew me back into nonfiction, I would have written the 4th volume. One day I will.
Yes.
One day
There's still time.
There's still time, and I like writing fiction. It exercises different muscles from the muscles that I exercise writing nonfiction. And getting inside the heads of characters is something you can do in fiction that it's much harder to do in nonfiction. Fundamentally, that's it for me. I feel very privileged. I feel blessed to lead the life I lead. I'm hugely grateful to my readers for making it possible for me to go on adventuring and exploring, and I just intend to go on doing that as long as I possibly can.
And I have a feeling you will.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Graham Hancock.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to work with you.
It's such a pleasure. Yeah. Thanks so much for watching, for listening to The Great Relearning. Our guest today, Graham Hancock, incredibly fortunate to be live with him in Concord, Massachusetts, the USA. Check out the website. Once again, thanks to the Marion Institute and the 3 Baldwin brothers, Michael and Ian and Philip. And we will see you next time. Welcome back to The Great Relearning. We are in the Great Relearning room with the 3 Baldwin brothers, Ian and Philip and Michael Baldwin, to discuss Graham Hancock and his voluminous work and perspective on our human experience. Gentlemen, welcome.
Good to be back.
What a remarkable...
with you, Rob.
Yes, thank you. What a remarkable adventure. Our very first, we should let our listeners and viewers know, our very first face-to-face interview, and what a delight to be in the same room with Graham Hancock. So what did you make of our conversation, gentlemen?
Shall I say something?
Yeah, do.
Why not? Why not?
I was particularly pleased because Graham's body of work is huge, stretching across 30 years. And I can say right from the outset, I hope very much that Graham will be a repeat interviewee in this series and come back and talk to us about many other aspects of his work. But I thought it was wonderfully appropriate at this stage of the game that we were so focused on so-called prehistory and going back into the ice ages. The whole subject of the ice ages is in itself fascinating, and the way in which the Younger Dryas was a precursor to, as I think Graham said, our so-called current civilizational progress. And I think that's exactly where it all needs to start, because we're operating, again, as Graham so eloquently made clear, we're operating from so many incomplete or downright wrong stories about our origins. And as in so many domains, it's like an onion. We keep peeling it back. I was fascinated about the business about North America and the fact that possibly people were in North America tens and 50 and more thousands of years ago. And we keep pushing these things back. And again, that's a crucial point he made. It's a work in progress. It's a conversation. There is no, or there should be no received wisdom, because it's constantly evolving. And I think he conveyed that beautifully, I thought, in this interview.
Yeah,
I agree totally, Philip. I think that, I think, first of all, I was terribly pleased that he used Gobekli Tepe as his main, because he's just got dozens of places around the Earth that show you sort of anomalies. How could these places have arisen
with such incredible sophistication. But the Gobekli Tepe one has a really special element to it, I think, which is the sophisticated way in which it's pointing to a date. And that date is that, is it 11,800 when the Younger Dryas started? And then the other thing that for me was such a penny drop, because I go to look at these places like the Gobekli Tepe, and I go, how in God's name did they possibly have this ability to create something when they're all hunter-gatherers out of just sort of, hello, one day we're doing it? But that's where I got so much realizing, no, there has to have been an incredible civilization that got wiped. And there was, of course, this immense sophistication, wisdom, knowledge, whatever. So it was really, I mean, I think I've been slow at the switch on that one.
Yeah, this idea of a technology transfer from a more
the technology transfer.
Yeah, people who may have been mostly wiped out to a hunting and gathering.
And then burying it. The
time capsule.
Burying
Crazy.
it. I mean, as he points
That
out,
was
there's
amazing.
probably more energy and work that went into burying the place than creating it.
And I have to say, jumping in, I didn't fully understand why they would ever do that until he and I had that conversation. And he really did a beautiful job of unpacking that in a way that helped me anyway.
Yeah.
Well, you should tell us because, or one of you should tell me. Yes, I think Michael puts his finger on it. The Younger Dryas started, when did he say? 600 years ago.
11,000.
11,000, thanks.
800.
And it abruptly ends. And so he makes the point that, which we've lost, and it's part of when I say, when I have said the mystery, we've lost the fantastic orientation part of nature that is somehow different from the rest of nature because it appears on a day-to-day basis to be frozen, which are the heavens, and all the constellations, which are abstract and requires a feature of the mind that I've never fully understood. But they've got what?
Excuse me.
So they identified on the ecliptic 12, as he points out, actually 13 constellations, and they orient all their myth making and so much their building and so forth to those 12. So it's very hard for us to recognize what John Lash calls naked eye astronomy as being a living, very ancient body of knowledge out of which is spooled their version of astronomy perhaps much later, which is what is it? Astronomy. It's naked eye astrology. It's naked eye astronomy made into mythos, made into psychology. So yeah, I had never thought of it, but boom, it's an abrupt beginning in 11,600 before the present. It's an abrupt beginning. And yet when you uncover it, which started to happen in 1996, there's no way it could you can weave it into the understanding of all of us archaeology, namely hunter-gatherers existed back then and only.
Yeah.
And civilization was a few thousand years off in the future. So it's a radical moment.
Yeah.
The thing that I wish had come up more in the conversation because it's crucial and it's entirely complementary to everything you're saying, is the whole story about precession of the equinox.
Yeah.
Now, the conventional story, or at least one of them, is that Ptolemy identified precession of the equinox, which is almost pathetically absurd because the archaeological evidence that the precession of the equinox has been known for a long, long, long time, and it keeps coming up in discoveries, both archaeological and in mythology. And I think a great deal of this is in the famous book by de Santillana, the Harvard
Hamlet's Mill.
Hamlet's Mill. And he comes at it from a mythological point of view. Graham comes at it more from an archaeological point of view. But the precession of the equinoxes, if you stop to think about it, given that it's 26,000 and some odd years long, a one cycle duration, 26,920, I believe, roughly. And that means that people have been around observing this stuff with a great deal of precision for a great deal of time.
Correct.
And of course, the $64,000 question is why? What is the magic? And it's such an, if you investigate the details of precession, it is simply staggering. And to grasp how that works in the absence of modern astronomical equipment is mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing. Google it for anybody who's listening. Google precession of the equinoxes. There's masses of material on it, and it's all there. It's spelled out quite nicely.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. Graham,
and the Sphinx is the most powerful demonstration of it in so to speak historical times. And it was nice the way you got Graham to explain that, because it's a double whammy. It's not only astronomical, namely the Sphinx was built during the time when Leo was on the ascendant, so to speak, but it was the guy who first did that got his sidekick, Schock, the geologist, to look at it from a weathering. And he said, this has been weathered. This stone has been weathered, for 8,000 years or whatever the number is.
That's right.
And which coincided with Leo being the age.
Yeah.
And Leo is the Sphinx.
Yeah.
So it is, when you get that kind of evidence put before you, and you realize how intransigent the professions are, it is a head shaker. It's a head shaker.
Yeah, and it speaks maybe to our focus here at the Great Relearning on the past and present and possible futures, pasts and futures of human experience, because I think what's so impressive about Graham, many things, but his relentless command of interdisciplinary forms of knowledge. Like in talking with him for as long as we did, I was really struck by how he brings archaeology and astronomy and anthropology and history and mythos and geology, and he brings it all to the table. And in a 21st century world where the academy is so divided and so compartmentalized and so rigid, it was so refreshing to be in the presence of someone who's really immersed himself as a journalist.
Did we love the Hoover? Did we love the Hoover Dam?
Yeah.
Yes. Wonderful.
A sky map in the Hoover Dam.
Map in the Hoover Dam.
Because there a lot of scholars say, well, why would they do that? Even that's ridiculous. 1930, they're doing it.
It's ridiculous, except that it's been happening for tens of thousands of years. But
well, we did send out the probe. Was it the Viking probe in the 70s with the symbolism of from Leonardo da Vinci? And I mean, There's a certain awakeness, but it's fragmented.
Yeah.
Philip? Oh, yeah.
There are two other things that maybe we could talk about. One is his discussion of Mott and the moral universe. And the other is what Michael, I think you were or Philip mentioning, which is how these sites are, this evidence is being uncovered. Because up until listening to Graham and you, Rob, I still subscribe to origins of humans in North and South America as in this 13,000, maybe 18,000 window BP. But apparently that's not the case.
Well, isn't it extraordinary about Gobekli Tepe? We really only, I mean, I remember first reading about it in whatever book it was of Graham's, only about 5 years ago. I'd never heard of the place. And nobody had until the German archaeologist came along in, was it either 1993 or 1996?
Six.
And the whole story, you upend an apple cart profoundly.
Yeah.
Boom.
Yeah.
And by the way, this is going to go on happening. It's going to go right up.
Yes.
I loved, frankly, the ending, Rob, that you have each author weigh in about a suggestion. And of course, I was fascinated, Ian, as you bring up Mott and the balance, the scale, and the feather on one side and the heart on the other. And the point being, as far as the Egyptians were concerned, that, at time of death, you're going to be weighed with respect to what you did with, as Graham points out, this incredibly precious, once in sort of in a lifetime type of life. How did you waste it or not? And of course, you want to make sure that the heart doesn't drop the scale down too much, because that's showing that you have probably wasted it a bit. And I love the way he finished with, why, people need to seek, they need to explore, they need to learn, they need to be inquisitive. And of course, so much of the scientists are so set and rigid and difficult to budge, to be open, because as I think he points out, to say I was wrong and Graham is right, or some other scientist is right about expanding a point of view, is just anathema. And that's so much of what's wrong with the world today. So I love the ending. I thought the ending was great.
Thanks, Michael. I did too.
Yeah. He also introduces a notion that swims under the surface of us talking, but it's there, which is the idea of devolution. And he raised to that.
Right. That's part of our theme.
Yeah.
It is. Ian, can you...
the way he put it is, consciousness was much higher in ancient Europe, Egypt,
right,
than it is today. And I think that whole process is something we need to explore, not now, but it needs to be looked at.
Yep.
As an antidote to the extreme narcissism of the species in 2023.
Yeah, very good. Okay.
Well, that seems like a beautiful place to end.
Good.
Well,
Great.
Gentlemen, thank you for once again assembling in the great relearning room. And thank you for making possible the conversation with Graham Hancock. And I really like, I think all of your, I agree with all of your hope that perhaps we can bring all of our guests back on periodically, episodically, as we spool out these conversations about the great relearning. Of course, special thanks to the Marion Institute and to Michael and Philip and Ian, to all three of you for making this possible. Looking forward to our next adventure. Until then.
Indeed.
See you soon.
Thank you, Rob.
Thanks, guys.
Rob. Very good.